Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit that like button, leave a comment telling us what you think will happen next, and subscribe so you don't miss the most jaw-dropping human versus galaxy tales out there. Trust me, you won't want to blink. The bar hung in a perpetual haze of smoke and neon, orbiting a planet whose surface had been scorched clean by 100 different conflicts. The walls were plastered with hollow trophies, each one a grim badge of profit or conquest. The air vibrated with the low hum of alien dialects, punctuated by bursts of laughter that were sharper than the edge of a vibrablade. At a corner table, beneath a flickering amber light, sat a figure wrapped in a hood. No one paid him much attention at first, which suited him perfectly. The warbidders were a predictable lot. They slouched in their chairs with the air of billion-credit entitlement, their armor and jeweled insignias marking them as patrons of destruction rather than participants. They traded information like currency, discussing planetary sieges, mercenary contracts, and death tolls as casually as a bartender pouring drinks. To them, humans were mere curiosities, fragile and expendable, a species not worth the ledger space they occupied. The hooded man lifted his glass with a deliberate calm, swirling the dark liquid inside like it contained secrets that no one else could hope to touch. The first bidder, a towering xenohuman with a silver crest streaked across his forehead, leaned forward and let a derisive laugh escape. "A human," he said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Do they even survive long enough to learn how to fight, or are they just casualties in someone else's war?" Another bidder snorted, flicking a clawed finger toward the hooded man. "I'll bet he wouldn't last a week on the front lines. I'd pay to see him try." His companions joined in, offering wagers and mock challenges, their amusement ringing hollow. They did not notice the slight tension that rippled through the hooded figure's shoulders, the way his hand tightened around the glass without spilling a drop. The hooded man said nothing. He did not need to. The room's laughter rolled over him like distant thunder, unaware that storms were forming in plain sight. Each name the bidders uttered, the name of a war, the designation of a mercenary group, touched a nerve he had long since learned to control. There was a history in those syllables, a ledger of lives measured not in credits but in choices, in the faintest imprints left on the skin and soul. A younger bidder, eager to impress, reached out, tapping the table with a gloved hand. "Come on, human. Show us what you've survived. Surely a species famed for being delicate has something to brag about." His grin was sharp, teeth glinting beneath his lips. The hooded man finally allowed a small motion. He shifted his sleeve, revealing the faintest trace of etched marks along his wrist. Not tattoos, not decorations, but scars, each one precise, deliberate. The markings stopped just short of the surface, as if they were records waiting to be read. The laughter faltered. One bidder squinted, curiosity flickering across his expression. What are those?" he asked, his tone unsure for the first time. The hooded man raised a single finger, gesturing toward the array of hollow screens floating near the bar. Each one displayed the banners of conflicts funded by the bidders themselves. He did not speak. He only let the scars, the silent tally of experience, do the talking. The bar seemed to tighten around him. Conversations lowered, eyes darted, and the usual bravado of the war bidders faltered. The hooded man had not raised his voice, had not drawn a weapon, and yet he had shifted the balance in a room accustomed to dominance and wealth. He remained still, serene, unassuming in a way that made the bidder's own confidence feel brittle. One bidder leaned back, swallowing hard, realizing for the first time that this human was more than a curiosity. The marks on his arm were not just scars, they were a record of wars survived, of impossible odds endured, of conflicts that the galaxy itself had written off. And some of these very wars, were ones the bidders had profited from, counting bodies and credits in equal measure. The hooded man sipped his drink again, deliberately slow, letting the tension stretch. The room waited, uncertain what would come next. And then, with a subtle movement, he let the sleeve fall back down, hiding the tally once more. The war bidders returned to their murmurs, but the laughter never came back. Something had shifted, and they could feel it even if they did not yet understand. The door hissed open, letting in a rush of recycled air and the faint scent of ozone. The hooded figure did not move, but all eyes flicked toward the doorway, curiosity mingled with unease. Whoever had entered, or was about to enter, would either tip the scales further or confirm the unspoken truth. Humans, when underestimated, carried consequences far beyond what any ledger could contain. And just like that, the scene was set. The galaxy's smug war bidders had met a silent anomaly. The kind that did not need to speak to claim attention. The kind that could make a room of armed elites hold their breath without firing a shot. For now, the hooded man remained still, a quiet storm at the corner table. But every mark on his wrist promised stories, survival, and a reckoning that had only just begun. The bar had fallen into a tense hush, the usual clatter of glasses and murmur of alien tongues replaced by a heavy awareness of the hooded man. Eyes that once mocked now flicked toward him, measuring, calculating, questioning. The scars on his wrist were faint but unmistakable, each one a silent monument to battles the galaxy had forgotten. One of the war bidders, an elder with a jagged cranial ridge and eyes that had seen too many prophet-led campaigns, leaned closer, curiosity overcoming bravado. "What are those?" he asked again, softer this time, almost reverent. The hooded man lifted a gloved hand and let it fall slowly, exposing the full span of markings etched into his skin. Each scar was deliberate, uniform, and precise, forming a tally that read like a ledger of war. He did not speak immediately, letting the bidders digest what they saw. The youngest among them shifted uneasily, realizing that these were not mere symbols or tribal decorations. They were confirmations of survival, of conflicts fought and endured under impossible circumstances. Finally, the hooded man's voice broke the silence, low and measured. "Each mark is a war I've survived. Not a contract. Not a favor. A war I lived through when others did not." His words were calm, almost casual, but every syllable carried weight. He named the battles quietly, each one a galaxy-wide atrocity that the bidders had funded, counted, and dismissed. "And some of these," he said, lifting his arm slightly, "are wars you believed to have zero survivors. You were wrong." The bidders glanced at one another, the confident smirks they had carried into the bar now faltering. One of them, a tall figure with metallic eyes that reflected the flickering hollow trophies, tried to laugh, but it came out strained. "Impossible," he muttered. "Those theaters were cleansed. Every operative accounted for zero survivors." The hooded man's lips curved slightly, a shadow of a smile beneath the hood. "Cleansed? Perhaps in your ledgers. In reality I was there. I saw what you assumed could not exist. And I survived. Every one of them." He let the words linger, each syllable a quiet accusation, a subtle unveiling of human resilience. Another bidder, younger and more reckless, gestured toward the scars. "You're human," he said, disbelief mingled with fear. Why are you still alive? How?" The hooded man looked at him directly, and though his eyes were partially hidden, the weight behind them was unmistakable. "Because humans do not measure survival in contracts or currency. We measure it in choices. In who we protect, who we leave behind, and who we refuse to become. You see a tally. I see decisions, consequences, and lives that were worth fighting for." A subtle murmur rippled through the room. The war bidders had spent decades calculating profit, casualties, and expendable numbers, yet here was a single human shattering their assumptions. He had not raised a weapon. He had not made a threat. He had simply revealed a ledger they could not comprehend, human experience distilled into scars and silence. One of the older bidders, the one with jagged ridges across his skull, leaned closer again, curiosity battling disbelief. How many of these were against our contracts?" His voice was almost a whisper, as though speaking louder might summon consequences. The hooded man lifted his arm further, exposing scars that ran along his forearm in neat, almost mathematical lines. "Several. Enough to remind you that humans do not belong in your calculations. Enough to remind you that when you treat life as currency, someone always pays the real price." The room seemed to contract around him, the low hum of conversation replaced by the weight of his presence. Alien mercenaries, war financiers, and seasoned bidders all felt it, the quiet but absolute authority of a human who had survived what they thought was impossible. They had mocked him an hour ago. Now they watched him like a storm they could neither predict nor contain. The youngest bidder, the one who had spoken first, paled visibly. You were in our wars?" he stammered, disbelief shaking his voice. "All of them?" The hooded man's hand moved subtly, a motion so small it could be missed by anyone not watching closely. "I was," he said. "And I am still here. I count the scars because they matter. Because every one of them is proof that humans endure, and that arrogance is costly." He let his words sink in, each one striking harder than any weapon. A silence fell over the bar, deeper than any before. Even the holographic displays, the glowing symbols of conquest, seemed muted in comparison. The bidders were no longer merchants of death. They were witnesses to a quiet reckoning, a living testament to a species they had long underestimated. The hooded man lowered his arm slowly, letting the sleeve fall into place and conceal the tally once more. He leaned back, taking a measured sip of his drink as if to remind them that he could have spoken louder, shown more, acted violently, but chose not to. Control, restraint, and history weighed in his favor. And in that moment it became clear. The central conflict was no longer just about arrogance versus survival, profit versus people. It was about understanding the cost of underestimating humanity, and the quiet fury of a soldier who had seen what no ledger could contain. The war bidders had entered the bar confident in their superiority. Now they realized that they had stumbled into the presence of someone who could not be dismissed, someone whose scars told a story far larger than their wealth or weapons could ever account for. The door at the far end of the bar hissed open again, a rush of recycled air announcing the arrival of a new presence. The hooded man did not move, but all eyes flicked toward the entrance, the tension in the room thickening. Whatever, or whoever, stood beyond the threshold, it would collide with the silent power already perched at the corner table, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the bar. The hooded man sipped his drink once more, each quiet movement deliberate. The war bidders shifted, glanced at one another, and realized that their mockery had transformed into a challenge they had no hope of understanding. And as the tension settled into a dangerous stillness, it became evident that the human sitting in the corner had already begun rewriting the rules. The hooded man leaned back in his chair, the amber light catching the faint ridges of scars along his forearm. For a moment, the bar seemed to exhale, as if even the walls recognized the gravity of the presence seated at the corner table. The war bidders, once smug and sure of their supremacy, now shifted uneasily. Their earlier mockery had evaporated, leaving only the quiet realization that the human before them carried experience and intent they could neither quantify nor challenge. He lifted his head slowly, allowing the hood to slide back just enough to reveal a face lined with both age and fatigue, yet resolute in every detail. There were no artificial augmentations, no bioluminescent implants, only a man whose body and mind had been tested in ways these mercenary financiers could barely comprehend. His eyes swept across the room, sharp and calculating, observing the subtle shifts in posture, the tiny instinctive retreats. He had learned long ago that control came not from weapons or numbers, but from perception and timing. One bitter, braver, or perhaps more foolish, leaned forward, metallic eyes reflecting the ambient glow. You fought, everywhere. Oh. What makes humans endure when everything else falls apart? The question was not idle curiosity. It was an attempt to grasp a truth that refused to be captured by statistics or ledgers. The hooded man let the silence stretch, long enough for his presence to fill every corner of the bar. Humans do not endure because of strength, he said, his voice quiet but firm. We endure because of purpose. Because we value what others treat as expendable. Each life remembered, each choice accounted for, that is our currency, our method of war. You calculate profit. We calculate consequence. He began to recount a story, measured in detail yet unhurried. A planetary siege funded by the very war bidders who now sat before him. Cities razed, armies annihilated, civilians left in the margins of mercenary accounting. The human forces he had led were outnumbered, outgunned, and technically doomed. And yet they survived. They adapted. They turned rubble into barricades, debris into weapons, and fear into strategy. The bidders listened, some scoffing internally at the idea, but none daring to interrupt. He paused to trace a scar along his arm with a gloved finger. This one, he said, voice low, was carved during a night when every human soldier on that planet was expected to die. Yet we did not. We took the ground back, not because we were stronger, but because we refused to accept the ledger's verdict. Every scar is a story of refusal, of standing when the galaxy expected us to fall. A younger bidder swallowed hard, gaze flicking to his companions. You weren't just surviving. You were closing the wars ourselves. His words carried disbelief, a dawning recognition that humans were not merely participants in galactic conflicts, they were arbiters. The hooded man allowed the small smile to return, subtle and knowing. I was deployed as a war closer. When conflicts drag on, when contracts fail to yield profit, when every outcome is assumed predetermined, humans are sent in to rewrite the result. We do not negotiate. We do not plead. We endure. We survive. We win, not for currency, not for accolades, but because someone must. The room had grown colder, though the heaters had not failed. The weight of experience in the hooded man's eyes pressed upon every chair and table. The war bidders were no longer financiers. They were witnesses to a force they had spent lifetimes underestimating. Every holographic display of conquest and ledgered atrocity seemed to shrink, meaningless in the face of human will distilled into a single body. Another bidder, teeth gritted and hand hovering near a concealed sidearm, finally dared to speak. Why show us this? Why not finish us now if you're as unstoppable as you claim? The hooded man's gaze cut to him, unwavering. Because destruction is easy. Understanding is far more precise. You need to see what your arrogance overlooks. You need to recognize that humans are measured not by profit or casualty, but by the consequences you cannot calculate. He sipped his drink deliberately, letting the action punctuate the lesson. He shifted slightly, exposing another series of scars along his inner forearm. These tally marks are not threats. They are evidence. Each one represents a conflict where humans endured, often where others failed. And each one serves as a reminder: underestimate us and the consequences will reach beyond your ledgers, beyond your contracts and far past your calculations. The youngest bidder's hands trembled slightly as he clasped them over the table. His companions exchanged uneasy glances, the first true signs of fear crossing their faces. They had entered the bar expecting to assert dominance, to mock a lone human for amusement. Instead, they had discovered an entity who embodied the principle that humanity, when cornered, calculated not with statistics but with purpose, memory and relentless survival instinct. The hooded man reclined once more, his hood sliding fully into place, yet the aura of command did not fade. The room, though bustling with alien patrons, felt contained in a bubble of tension, every eye tracing the lines of his scars, every mind racing to comprehend a methodology that defied profit-led warfare. And as the door at the far end of the bar hissed open once again, letting in a subtle draft of recycled air, the hooded man did not move. He did not need to. The war bidders realized that the confrontation they had anticipated would not come through noise or violence but through the quiet, inevitable assertion of human will. The central conflict had shifted. It was no longer merely human versus galactic arrogance. It had become the question of recognition, whether the galaxy would see humans as a species to mock and exploit, or a force whose endurance and judgment could not be denied. The hooded man sat, silent yet dominant, a quiet storm at the center of a room built on assumptions. The war bidders could only watch, waiting to see what action, if any, would follow this revelation. The story of scars, of wars survived, and of consequences earned had begun, and the next move belonged not to the bidders, but to the human who had already rewritten the rules. The hum of the bar felt heavier now, the alien chatter muted beneath a weight that no one could name. The war bidders had stopped moving, stopped speaking, as if their presence alone acknowledged the quiet storm seated at the corner table. The hooded man remained still, drinking slowly, letting the silence stretch, a living demonstration that dominance did not require noise or theatrics. A young bidder shifted in his chair, the metallic glint of his implants catching the flickering light. He leaned forward, curiosity laced with fear. "You've survived wars we funded," he said, voice barely audible. "Every one of them. And yet you sit here, calm. What? Why not strike?" The hooded man's hand traced another scar along his forearm. "Because destruction is not necessary to command respect. Fear does not require weapons. You will understand soon enough, but not through pain inflicted upon you. Through realization. Through acknowledgement of what you cannot calculate." The eldest bidder, the one whose cranial ridges marked decades of conquest, leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "And if we refuse to acknowledge it?" he asked, tone tinged with arrogance and panic. "If we try to assert control now?" A faint smile traced the corners of the hooded man's mouth. "Then you will learn the cost of underestimation. But I will not initiate conflict here, not in neutral space. The consequences of arrogance are best observed when you act first." His words hung like a shadow over the bar, precise, deliberate, measured. The younger bidder, shaking now, fumbled for his communicator. The metallic fingers hesitated over the buttons. "Security, get." He froze as the hooded man's gaze swept the room, subtle yet absolute. Every movement slowed. Every instinct honed. It was not a threat, but a presence. A single human, unaugmented, unenhanced, yet more commanding than any army or mercenary he had ever deployed. The bar's other patrons, alien and human alike, leaned back, sensing the shift. A single flick of the hooded man's hand, and the chatter would resume, but differently, with deference. Even the holographic displays of battles and ledgers seemed diminished in scale compared to the human whose scars told stories of survival beyond their comprehension. The eldest bidder swallowed hard, realizing that any attempt at confrontation would not be a negotiation but a surrender of control. The ledger of wars, the contracts, the credits, they meant nothing here. Only the human's presence mattered. Every calculated advantage, every mercenary advantage they had wielded across the galaxy was irrelevant when confronted with someone who had endured what they had bought and discarded. A tense silence filled the space as the youngest bidder tried to recover composure. You have been everywhere. You've survived where no one else could. But what do you want now? His words trembled, carrying the weight of a dawning understanding. The hooded man's hand moved subtly, resting on the table, fingers brushing the edge of a glass. I do not want, he said, voice calm but sharp, because what I do is not based on desire. It is based on principle. Humans endure. Humans survive. Humans correct imbalance. You have spent years counting profit and loss, life and death, without considering the variable you cannot calculate. That variable is humanity itself. One of the bidders, metallic eyes wide, realized the implication. You mean, you were in our wars and now you? He faltered, fear overtaking curiosity. The hooded man leaned slightly forward, just enough to let the words settle. I am not here to erase you. Yet. I am here to ensure that arrogance does not go unchecked. You have treated life as currency. You have mocked a species you cannot measure. That mistake will not repeat. Any further attempts to exploit, to manipulate, to fund conflict without regard for consequence, will be met with human intervention. My choice. My terms. The younger bidder's hand twitched toward a sidearm, but instinct froze him. Even trained soldiers paused when faced with the unexpected weight of human resolve. The room, though filled with other patrons, contracted around the corner table, every presence aware that something had shifted irreversibly. A faint flicker of the holographic displays caught the hooded man's attention. He did not react to them directly but allowed the observation to underscore the point. He had seen the ledger of wars and he had survived each one. The war bidders had spent years calculating outcomes. He had spent those same years defying them. Every mark on his skin, every scar, was proof of both survival and judgment. The eldest bidder's breathing quickened. So, what now? What will you do? His voice was a whisper, though the desperation behind it was palpable. The hooded man's head tilted slightly, and for the first time, the full weight of his scars seemed to radiate an unspoken power. Now, he said, voice steady, you learn that underestimating humans carries consequences beyond credits, beyond ledgers, beyond your contracts. I do not need to strike. The knowledge of what I have survived and what I can endure is sufficient. You will act accordingly, or you will face the consequences of your own arrogance. The youngest bidder swallowed hard, realizing that even if he fled, the memory of this encounter would follow him. The room remained still, tension coiled like a spring. No one moved. No one challenged. They simply waited, understanding that the rules had shifted, that the hooded man had already claimed the measure of control without lifting a weapon. The door hissed open again, a subtle breeze entering the room, carrying with it the faint hum of the station. The hooded man did not look up. He did not need to. His presence alone dictated attention, commanded awareness, and ensured that the war bidders had been confronted with the undeniable reality. Humans were unpredictable, uncountable, and unyielding. And as the bar continued to hum quietly, the hooded man's fingers traced the rim of his glass. Each scar on his arm was a testament to wars survived, choices made, and consequences met. The war bidders, once confident in their dominance, now understood that they had misjudged the ledger of life itself. The reckoning had not yet come, but it would, and the final chapter would belong to the human who had already rewritten the rules. The bar's atmosphere had shifted entirely. The war bidders, once smug architects of galactic chaos, sat frozen, their composure shattered by the silent authority of the human in the corner. Even the chatter of alien patrons seemed to bend around him, subdued, cautious, as if recognizing a force they could not name. Every scar on his arm, every tally mark etched into skin and memory, radiated a quiet but absolute power. The youngest bidder, still trembling, managed to choke out a question. What will you do now? His words carried desperation, the realization that this was no longer a negotiation or an exchange of credits. This was a reckoning. The hooded man leaned forward slightly, letting the hood shadow his features, his voice calm but precise. Now, he said, the ledger balances. You have underestimated a species that does not count profit above principle, who does not negotiate when integrity is at stake, who does not accept defeat as a given. The mistakes you have made in calculation will echo across every contract, every war, every life you thought expendable. A ripple of panic passed through the bidders. One of them fumbled for a communicator, metallic fingers shaking. The hooded man's gaze met his, steady and unyielding. The gesture was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the effect immediate. The bidder froze, every instinct screaming that any action would trigger consequences beyond comprehension. It was not threat, it was inevitability. The eldest bidder leaned back, trying to regain control, yet his voice betrayed fear. You are one human. One. How can you? I am not one human, the hooded man interrupted softly, yet each word landed with the weight of a strike. I am every human who has endured, every soldier who has refused to yield, every choice that you have tried to erase from history. You deal in ledgers, we deal in consequences. And I am the one who ensures they are met. He lifted his arm deliberately, letting the faint glimmer of scars catch the ambient light. Each mark was a story of endurance, of choices made under fire, of lives saved when no one else would have survived. The bidders stared, the realization dawning that these were not mere trophies. They were an account of human resilience, unquantifiable and uncompromising. A flicker of movement at the doorway drew all eyes, but the hooded man did not flinch. Whoever entered became secondary in importance. The room, the bidders, and every calculation they had made for decades now existed only to witness him. He was both lesson and arbiter, silent yet unstoppable. The youngest bidder finally spoke again, voice trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. If we stop, if we acknowledge, you will act differently, the hooded man said. Not because you are forced, not because I threaten, but because you have seen what you underestimated. You will honor what you cannot calculate. And if you fail, he trailed his hand across the rim of his glass, a deliberate pause marking the weight of his unspoken promise. The consequences will be yours alone. The eldest bidder's breath quickened. He had survived countless conflicts, orchestrated battles that had erased civilizations, and yet here he was powerless. He realized that no weapon, no mercenary, no contract could undo what he had seen. This human did not need to fight. His presence alone rewrote the rules. The hooded man stood slowly, deliberately, allowing every eye to trace the lines of scars on his forearm. Each movement was precise, measured and unhurried, a display of absolute control. He did not raise a weapon, but the tension in the room became almost tangible, the air itself pressing down with inevitability. The war bidders felt it in their bones, the quiet authority of a species they had ignored, underestimated, and mocked. He leaned forward one last time, voice soft but impossible to ignore. Remember this, he said, humans endure. We survive. We correct imbalance. You cannot bargain with consequence, you cannot negotiate with principle, and you cannot erase what has been endured. Your arrogance ends here in this moment, witnessed by all who thought you were untouchable. A hush fell across the bar. The alien patrons, sensing the finality, stepped back. The war bidders, faces pale beneath jeweled crests, understood that they had been confronted not with rage, but with inevitability. The ledger of life, profit, and death had been rewritten, not by fire or violence, but by human will distilled into presence and scars. The hooded man turned, his cloak sliding back into place, concealing the tally once more. He moved toward the door with deliberate calm, each step a quiet declaration. No one dared stop him. Every head remained bowed, every thought aligned with the understanding that the galaxy had misjudged humanity. As he reached the threshold, he paused. Without looking back, he said, "Arrogance has a cost. Remember it." Then he stepped into the corridor beyond, leaving the war bidders in a room heavy with realization and dread. The door hissed closed, leaving silence in its wake, the echoes of human endurance lingering far longer than any weapon's blast. The story of scars, survival, and the consequences of arrogance had reached its climax. The war bidders were left to reckon with what they had witnessed, knowing that the human they had mocked was not a threat to be fought, but a force to be respected and never underestimated again. In that quiet, calculated moment, humanity had asserted itself, silent, relentless, and unbreakable. The galaxy had seen one human, and in him, it had glimpsed the full measure of what it meant to endure. The hooded man's tally of scars was more than a record, it was a declaration. Humans were not for sale, not for mockery, and never to be counted out. And in that declaration, the war bidders finally understood the truth they had long ignored. The most formidable force in the galaxy was not machines, not mercenaries, not contracts. It was the human will itself.